Well, hello again. We are going to speak about how experience refines connectivity of the brain and the rest of the nervous system. So, first, looking at the human being at birth, the newborn. The newborn comes with basically all the structures of the brain are there, however, on a smaller scale. And we understand that the brain comes with twice as many neurons as the adult brain has, but the size is small. So most of the development that we are going to see, which is 2/3 of the weight of the brain, most of that is going to have to do with the development of the dendrites, these branches, that branch of the body of the neuron. There are hundreds and thousands of them, and each one has little buds that we're going to speak about. And when you look at these molecular, very, very tiny structures, but you find them in the billions, they add up to something big. So they make a big, big part of the physical expansion of the brain. And the other part is myelination. Myelin is the insulation that wraps around the axons of neurons. So these two make the biggest components that expand the volume of the brain. However, the structures themselves, the neurons, are all present at birth. And the baby comes in with some basic networks that enable the baby to perform basic functions of survival to get the needs, the baby's needs fulfilled. So these networks that the baby has at birth are in rough draft, which means they are modifiable, and the experience, the environment is going to modify them to enable the person, to enable the whole nervous system to be the best fit for the body that it manages, and also to be the best fit for the environment that it survives in. For example, if someone is born on a very high altitude on top of a mountain, that, there isn't as much oxygen, for example, but there are people living there. So this nervous system is going to work and sculpt experience and the environment and the temperature and weather, everything is going to sculpt that body and make it adjust to these conditions of, for example, weather and the angle of the sun, and you name it. And the same for all kinds of skills and all kinds of behaviors. So these networks and circuits that the baby's brain comes to life with, or after the baby comes out of the womb, they are highly, highly modifiable and very, very plastic. And that connectivity doesn't last long. And the connectivity that the environment stimulates, when you get the experience and you create networks that capture that experience, these networks will stay for a long time, for a lifetime, basically, unless there's something abnormal that occurs. So also increasing research shows that babies come with basic types of knowledge. And they are tested, for example, in this video that I posted on Blackboard, when the babies are tested at 3 months. 3 months is kind of the reasonable age that you can get a reliable response. You probably might, if you go down, but the studies have been done on as young as 3 months. And that determines that they show and demonstrate, as you could see in the video, that babies are born with the instinct to know what is right and what is wrong, and to have a sense of justice, for example. And as they grow older, like say 6 months or maybe more, a little bit older, they are, they ally, they sympathize more with the person against whom injustice was done. So it's a very, very interesting video, but it just shows evidence of these networks that the baby comes to life, comes to the world with, and it gives the baby the ability to function within these limits. So everything else now is left for the environment. So you could clearly see that the environment really plays a major role, a major role. And again, we are beyond that discussion of is it the environment, is it the brain? That is totally shouldn't be a debate, should not be a subject for a debate at all. You have to have both conditions. You have to have the seed first that has, the information in it to grow a tree. And then you have to give it water and to nourish it. And that tree is that seed is going to then grow, but without the other is not going to. So that is not a fair kind of discussion to have in the first place. So connectivity, how the brain, again, how the neurons establish synaptic connections, and then they establish pathways that connect different regions of the brain, front to back, left to right, and then downward. All of this is induced by the environment. So number one, the baby comes with genetically, these networks that are there, they're genetically programmed, and because obviously before the baby comes, the role is limited. And of course, there's an internal environment, but these patterns of connectivity that the baby comes with are predetermined by the genetic code of the DNA. So, but that kind of connectivity again is short term. It is not long lasting. So with sensory stimulation, the sounds that the baby hears over and over and over are going to, for example, just one example, are going to cause patterns of firing in the networks of the auditory system. And then these patterns of firings will be stored. And when the baby hears the sound or a word, the baby would recognize that sound or word because it is familiar now. So then you have, with this stimulation, you have established networks, and these networks are long lasting and they continue basically through adulthood. So it is sensory stimulation by seeing, by hearing, by touching, and so on. This is what we mean by sensory stimulation. It makes your nervous system connect better and get information, process information more effectively. So what you need here is you need to first connect, say there's an area here, and you need to connect the neurons within this area together so that you make it function as a unit, as an elementary unit for a certain, skill. But this area by itself, it cannot perform the function on its own. So it's connected with so many other areas. So you have to have local connectivity and regional connectivity between one region of the brain and the other. And these are long, these pathways or circuits basically connect different regions with each other. So what are the advantages again of, say, the human being is born with networks that are less sophisticated than an animal's networks? What is the advantage? And the advantage is we understand that for an animal, the animal needs to stand on its feet immediately as it is born, to be able to stand on its feet, to walk around, to even run, and to seek and to identify the mother, and to be basically just independent within hours. And if that is not the case, then how will the animals migrate? That is going to create a hardship. They will have to leave the babies back. And then and other animals will eat. So the baby is not going to survive. So to the extent that, the placenta, say a deer, as you saw in the movie, it eats its own placenta to eliminate the smell so that no animals can be attracted, and it does its best to disguise any traces that there was a baby there. So, but for the human being, you want someone who will be adapted to the environment. And because, the environment has so many, many risks and dangers. And then because 2/3 of the brain grow outside of the womb, that will give the environment the upper hand in actually shaping these connections and sculpting these connections, maybe getting rid of some of the ones that the rough draft ones, or maybe strengthening some of them, but most of the connections and then added after, through stimulation. That will give the ability of the environment to provide the sensory stimulation necessary to develop particular senses, like seeing something, hearing something, touching something. So all of these, smelling, for example, all of these are going to, by exposure over and over, are going to give the chance to the sensory mechanisms to connect, like, this is part of the sensory mechanisms, to connect with the higher areas of the brain that will take these signals and translate them. So before this, let me make this point here. Now, the main focus now, and this is well established, this chapter comes from like we call it the Bible of neuroscience. And it is called Principles of Neuroscience. It means these are the things, the golden rules, the things that have been established over and over. It's like saying the sky is blue, or there are, the planets are this way or that. No one is going to likely come and say, this is not supported. So, the way that we look at, IQ, and I'm sure all of you are educators, you have heard about growth mindset. It's some kind of a, buzzword for the past couple of years. And you have kind of heard a lot about moving away from the traditional way of intelligence and the fixed mindset, that thinking that the IQ, you have it and it's an ability or it is a skill. And that is really dangerous because that is not consistent with modern brain research. Modern brain research says intelligence is built. As a matter of fact, in order to define for anything skill to fall under intelligence, that skill, one of 2 or 3 conditions, it must be teachable. It must be learnable. I mean, I don't know if learnable is a word, but it must be a skill that you can actually learn and build through experience. Otherwise, it will not be intelligence. So growth mindset emphasizes that you develop your IQ through experience and through practice, and that you play a major role in actually expanding your intelligence, in deepening it, in making it more meaningful by applying the skills that you have on to different settings. There are many, of course, suggestions and recommendations and strategies for, say, giving feedback, for working with kids and having them understand that intelligence is flexible. It is something that is constructed through their own, motivation and experience that will fuel in them creativity and will encourage them to persevere. They will not see, for example, academic failure as something that they're destined to have, they see it as a way, something that will teach them, for example, new skills. By making mistakes, they learn. So how do they invest in these mistakes, and how they take these, the experience, and then avoid these mistakes and prevent them from happening again in the future. So they celebrate mistakes. It's, oh, now I made a mistake. I have a new opportunity to learn something new about my own way of learning. So anyways, there's a big push that we need to move away from that fixed mindset that really leads to failure, and it leads to passive, the person being a passive learner, as opposed to the one who follows a growth mindset mentality and is going to grow generations of interactive, responsible learners who take responsibility of their own learning. So, rough draft, again, when the baby comes in with these temporary networks, that is going to enable the environment to custom fit that, the body and the nervous system, so that they can function and help each other in the best way, and to enable the nervous system to be connected in a way that suits the environment. So, for example, the person, when you mentioned, someone may be living in a humid area. Now you need mechanism to enable you to deal with that level of humidity. Someone living in a dry area. Someone is living in an environment that is very full of stress, or the opposite, and so on. So all of this is going to produce different patterns of connectivity that will be suitable for the environment. So when we speak about patterns, a pattern is something that occurs over and over in the same manner, to the extent that you can predict it before it reoccurs or before it recurs. So, like if I say like this. So you can see the pattern now. You can predict what is going to happen because you have established a pattern. Now, let's say a sound wave, someone says something to me. Let's say an average adult female says something to me. The voice of that average adult female, on average, it has about 225 vibrations per second. So it will make the air go back and forth and vibrate about 225 times per second. We call it 225 hertz. When that signal comes in and hits the eardrum, guess how many times it will make the eardrum vibrate? Exactly, it will make it vibrate 225 times per second. Now, the signal is going to go into the middle ear, and the little bones kind of go back and forth then because they are connected with the eardrum. So then they will mimic exactly the vibration of the 225 times per second. And then the last bone called the stapes is connected with connected onto the cochlea on an area called the oval window. And it has like a flexible connection where it can actually kind of go a little bit out and then go back in like this. So when you hear the sound, it goes in and out, depending on how strong and how loud the sound is. And then the cochlea is all filled with fluid, and the fluid has nowhere to go, basically. So when you compress and go back, these movements that come originally from the outside as 225 vibrations Eventually, they are carried in, repeated by the stapes, 225 vibrations per second. Then the fluid itself now starts to make waves, hydraulic waves, and these waves will repeat also 225 times per second. Now, these waves are going to cause hair cells in the ear, as you see in the video, hair cells to be bent, down and up. They will repeat exactly the same pattern, 225 times per second. And at that level, when they go like this, every time they bend, they fire a spark. They fire an electric potential. And they will produce now 225 action potentials exactly in the same pattern that goes fire, 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 exactly in that same pattern, spaced out exactly to match the sound wave that came originally. So every sound that we have in a language has its own unique phonemic pattern. It is its own unique vibration patterns and all of this. And it is recorded in a particular set of neural firings. So when you establish, you hear the sound over and over and over, you get this network to connect and to fire this number of times. And now, every time you hear the sound, immediately you get the firing activated. And every time you even think about the sound, immediately the same network gets activated because that pattern of firing got established and the neurons remember that pattern. So it becomes easy to activate pathways. So if the person now has a hearing loss or has a lot of earwax frequently blocking their ears or middle ear infections, that is going to prevent this pattern from forming. And then you have foundations for all kinds of problems. You name it, language problems, speech problems, auditory processing problems, attention problems, and all kinds of, things, because you have milestones that are established, and on top of them, you have to have skills. If you don't have the milestones, you cannot establish the skills. This is how language and cognition work. So, patterns of neural activation that are stimulated by patterns of neural activity that are stimulated by sensory stimulation make the already, networks that are already established. It refines and realigns the patterns of connectivity or establish new patterns of connectivity. So it either enhances or if that system, that network doesn't work, it can establish a whole, different network. And of course, lack of experience, we call it sensory deprivation. That means if the child, for example, the family doesn't read with the child frequently. If the child doesn't hear language around her or around him frequently, that people interact with them and play with them and talk and speak and give the sounds of the language and have a rich environment that has a lot of sounds, speech sounds and language interactions, then that will be sensory deprivation in involving the auditory modality or the visual modality or the tactile modality, and you name it. And that could lead to serious consequences that will basically, if that occurs during the early, 3 years or 5 years, that could be irreversible. The consequences could be last for a lifetime. So again, if you could watch the video, it's online. And this is about sensory deprivation, and you'll find, it's a great video made, developed by Harvard. Now, all kinds of learning depend on the principle that I explained. that means that principle is that learning and cognitive abilities, all cognitive abilities, are experience dependent. In order for you to develop in the ability, for example, visual processing and visual perception, you have to see, you have to be exposed to photons of light that stimulate your the cells in your eyes to connect and to, channel information. And the same for hearing, the same for taste, any kind of sense, you have to make it practice. You have to give it experience. And experience for the auditory system is hearing, or listening to different sounds. Experience for visual is to see, is to read, is to see in different colors and all of that, and so on. So the other component is, so we agree that this is an established principle of all kinds of learning, that learning and cognitive abilities that develop as a result of learning, they are the result of experience. And the level of skill, how efficient the person is in a given skill, how developed that skill is going to depend on the degree of familiarity, which means how many times did you practice. Obviously, someone who rides a bicycle, say two children, one has practiced 12 times riding a bicycle, one has practiced only 6 times riding the bicycle. Who is more likely, given that they're the same age and same neurological makeup and all of this, who is more likely to master the skill of bike riding first and in a more meaningful way? Obviously are going to say, yeah, the one who spent the 12 hours. But in addition to that, you have to say the quality. For example, in that particular every hour that this person spent, how extensive was the experience, how meaningful, and all of this. So the degree of familiarity, it means how many times the person practices the skill or is exposed to a certain sensory stimulation kind. That is going to determine how much the person takes in and how much the person stores in their cerebral cortex. The degree of familiarity determines how comprehensive that level of knowledge and level of learning the person is acquiring. So it determines how comprehensive. Because sometimes if there are problems, the person will have gaps. They will take like small things and leave most of the information. And it also will determine how fast the person can learn and how fast the person can remember. So, in effect, the degree of familiarity, you can summarize it as such. It leads to, high levels of familiarity when you are exposed to and you practice, and it leads to cognitive efficiency. Cognitive efficiency has 2 components. One, it has to do with speed. How fast can you do something in a given period of time? And 2, the second component of cognitive efficiency is quality. How accurate are you able to do the work that you are doing in that given period of time? So accuracy and timing, both of them make cognitive efficiency. And the idea is you will be cognitively efficient if you are able to do something fast and accurate as well at the same time. So this is this is basically the core of any kind of learning. Again, exposure, experience, and the level of experience, the level of exposure, and the frequency of exposure are going to determine how effective, how extensive, and the learning is, and how cognitively efficient the person is. In the past, like we speak about maybe 1800s, maybe even and before, they would look at the brain size as basically bigger is better, is better. And they had machines like what you see there to measure the skull size. And if you have a larger brain, they presumed that the person is smarter, which is, of course, totally false. So the idea is that it is not the number of neurons that you have. It is not how big the brain is. Because as a matter of fact, there's a whole disorder, big disorder called macrocephaly, larger brain. And that produces so many mental and cognitive disorders, and many people cannot function at all. So also there's microcephaly, smaller brain. So, but again, the idea of the larger brain is the brain efficiency is not dependent on how big or small that brain is. As a matter of fact, for example, an ant has a tiny brain, but per speck, it packs more neurons than, say, a big mammal walking around, or than us. And the same for birds. All these little animals that they have a small brain, but in per speck, you have more neurons packed than we do. So again, it's not the size of the brain, and it is basically doesn't have anything to do with how many neurons you have. And we have the evidence that the baby is born with 200 billion neurons. And by adolescence, that number is cut in half, and you get rid of half of these neurons. So it comes down to experience. Why? Because experience induces connectivity, stimulates the nervous system and the brain to connect. And once you connect, this is the best, basically, this is the ultimate goal. Once you are able to communicate and connect, and the better connected you are, the more efficient you become. And again, remember, keep this in mind, connectivity is stimulated, is induced by experience. Neuroplasticity. We explained it before. Neuroplasticity is the process of modifying and reorganizing synaptic connectivity and the neural circuits in response to sensory stimulation, to experiences. Or the process of modifying and reorganizing synaptic connectivity and neural circuits due to absence of specific kinds of sensory stimulation. So either way, neuroplasticity, it basically means modifications. It means kind of changing the connections among neurons and among circuits. So modifying them on a constant basis. And this is what the brain does. It's basically the texture of the brain itself. It is like toothpaste, and the consistency of it is more similar to toothpaste. So it is constantly being modified and constantly, connecting and severing connections, making new connections, and constantly, second by second, minute by minute, it is adjusting and readjusting. But the highest level of connectivity is found at birth and during the first 3 to 5 years. And then it slightly just goes down a little bit, and then it continues, and then 8 months it goes up, and then goes again, continues, and then near adolescence, you have a peak in connectivity, and then starts to kind of plateau and decrease. And after that, it continues through the human life cycle, but on a smaller scale. And we'll explain why, what is how this happens and what the advantages. So it is highest at birth. And as you continue forming networks and making these networks dedicated and connected and consolidated, then the brain is gonna guard them and focus on them and direct all its, most of its energy onto consolidating and, these networks. And so again, the peak, when we speak about the brain development, the big part of it is connectivity. So it doesn't necessarily it does involve like creation of new neurons, as we mentioned, but the biggest part of it is when neurons make connections. That is what makes things happen, because the whole system is about communication. So the neuroplasticity aspect involves also neurogenesis. It involves the creation of new neurons. So these new neurons are kind of born, and they contribute to circuits by either establishing new circuits or expanding on existing circuits or doing different kinds of work. And these mechanisms, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, are the two mechanisms that enable us to have that kind of flexibility in wiring and rewiring, so that we can continue learning throughout life. Without these two processes, even one of them, we will not be able to learn anything new, and we probably will be forgetting a lot of what we already know. So that is a continuous process, but as I explained before, neurogenesis is selective. It is only found in two regions of the brain after birth, and these have to do with the limbic system, the memory system, hippocampus, and one area around it. The patterns of neuroplasticity, there are two different things. For example, neuroplasticity and from birth to, or even before birth, to adolescence. This is one kind. It has its own nature. And then the other kind of neuroplasticity is the adult neuroplasticity that begins after the body is shaped and completed in growth and development, which is the end of adolescence. And then that is adulthood. So that kind of plasticity that continues through adulthood, it is distinguished in many ways from early childhood neuroplasticity, and we'll discuss it. So, and basically, briefly, the childhood neuroplasticity, it is characterized by having molecular structures that create ideal conditions for modifying and for realigning and, for example, severing connections and making new connections and kind of building and rebuilding and flexibility all the time. So there are molecular structures that make that possible, that facilitate that environment, so that there's not as much of a commitment between one neuron and the other. They are hanging there, but if they see a benefit in staying there for a long time, and the benefit comes from the environment through stimulation, then they will stay and will strengthen their connectivity. However, if they see, there's a better advantage if I connect with that neuron, it is better than this because this one is more specialized and so on, and then, sever that connection and connect with someone else. During that process of synaptogenesis, actually axons and their terminals compete on synapsing or making connections with different targets. They all compete. They kind of extend the synaptic terminals and try to reach to places, and they have molecular markers that attract them and make them able to identify the sites and the other neurons that are like them that they can connect with. But neurons compete to connect on certain, neurons. And then the ones that cannot make it, then they're finally pushed out and phased out and leave. So that system of competition, of course, you could see as educators, you could see that it is an evolutionary process that enables the fittest, the best to stay and to do the work. It's the same like sperm, for example. The fastest, the one that is most powerful, is gonna go and make it to the egg. So for adulthood plasticity, the adult molecular structures that are there, when they say the little parts of the cells and outside, and the membrane, what's inside, what's outside, and all of that, there are molecules to promote stability. You want I made a connection, you want it to be stable, to stay there for good, for example. And also at the very same time, there are molecules to promote to prevent plasticity, to prevent the axons from severing and kind of breaking away, or to prevent things from changing as much as possible. So the two kinds, childhood plasticity and adulthood plasticity, these are just overviews. Different two major things. The level, the magnitude. The childhood neuroplasticity is remarkable. It's at the highest at all in your entire life. It just peaks, and it is the brain and the nervous system is so malleable, so flexible, you can shape it in any shape or form by experience. And in the adult brain, it is not as tremendous as it is in a baby, and we'll explain why. So also, the baby is basically doesn't have to go through a process of conscious learning, going to a university or going to a school. The baby is just, being interacted with, and just there's much less effort from the baby's part to acquire all of these things and develop these skills. So, however, neuroplasticity on the adult part is more deliberate. Like, in other words, you want to engage in skills. You want to sit down, for example, and you need to teach yourself to sit, kind of in a way so that you can pay attention and you can look, and you have to be engaged in the learning process in order to be able to acquire information. And you have to learn deliberately. However, for an infant, a newborn, they don't have to deliberately do much. At that time, most of from birth until age 6 months is mostly reflexive. They just behave based on the impulse more. So, we'll expand a little bit. So during childhood, from birth and on, the environment around neurons and inside of neurons promotes that flexibility. It doesn't make neurons commit to a certain connection or a certain set of connections. It makes it like temporary. Because if it at that time it has a connection or a set of connections, but if it sees there are better connections somewhere, or these connections are not stimulated anymore, and then there are other connections, stimulations that occur that will make that neuron to switch and go and connect with someone else. That is going to make it possible by having lack of commitment, by having short-term connectivity that can be modified. Also, the cellular mechanisms, they are optimal for forming, for example, synaptic connections. They are optimal for weakening synaptic connections. They are optimal for strengthening or eliminating. So all of these things are happening at once. Remember, at some point, the baby's brain is going to start to dismantle neurons and actually uproot neurons in the millions, and also will take synaptic dendritic branches and just basically eliminate them. And again, in the millions. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And at the same time, you are giving the neurons basically free range, giving them the ability to make connections. If they see another neuron stimulated, for example, that fires, they recognize it at the same time, and they connect with that neuron. And the saying goes, neurons that fire together wire together. So when something happens, and then you have a whole set of neurons responding, firing in response. And when they fire at the same time, they recognize each other and they start to connect with each other. So these conditions facilitate the alteration because, again, neuroplasticity is all about making new connections, severing old ones, modifying, and keeping altering these connectivity patterns on a regular basis, and that is what it means. So these conditions facilitate alterations in the architectural biochemistry in response to experience. So everywhere you go, you have to say, well, I need to have experience to stimulate that connectivity. And the stimulation can be positive or negative, of course. So again, there's no commitment in that developing newborn's brain as far as neurons and their connectivity patterns. So these are temporary, not firmly entrenched. And also, in addition, when a new pattern is formed, it doesn't impede the formation of another new pattern. That is very important. And they do not compete as much. So if you have, for example, two pathways or two networks that are building at the same time, they don't compete as much because you need this one and you need that one. Because the brain is making connections, establishing connections that are needed. However, for the adult, it is a little bit different. But anyways, the other point I want to make here is for the childhood neuroplasticity, it is that it is genetically determined, and it is a rough draft. It is not long-term, so that it can be modifiable, it is malleable, and it can be redesigned to fit the type of sensory stimulation the person is getting. So patterning, as I mentioned, remember the example of the sound wave coming in as 225 vibrations and finally going to the brain as 225 firings, 225 electric signals going in following a certain sequence that mimics the original sound that you heard. So patterning is the primary principle according to which all types of learning are acquired and developed. The brain learns by transforming sensory experiences of the world, seeing what you see, what you hear, what you touch, and so on, into patterns of electrical activity. And these patterns exactly mimic what you see outside or what you hear outside and so on. This patterning principle underlies the acquisition of all types of learning, cognitive abilities, language abilities, skills, behaviors, and everything that you can name. Thus, the nature and an extent of the sensory experiences are going to shape the structure and the function of the brain and the entire nervous system. So it all comes to experience. Or if there's lack of experience, then that is going to really have a huge impact. So in adulthood, now, once a pattern of connectivity is established, strong activation of that established circuit makes it almost kind of harder or impedes the development of another alternative wiring. It makes it harder. It makes it more effortful. So say someone learned to smoke and then they want to cease smoking. Now we have a whole pattern of connectivity associated with everything, even when the person just holds his or her fingers like this and they hold a pen like this, it is going to activate the neural pathway that is dedicated to smoking, and it will make the person crave the tobacco. So that is a pattern of connectivity that is established. We are not saying if this is good or bad. We are speaking about how a network is established. Now you want the person now to start to develop an alternative network. Now we have resistance now, because every time there's so many cues in the environment, and these are gonna activate the pathway that's already established. Every time it is activated, it is going to make it impede or make it harder to develop an alternative network. So this is what it takes a lot of, it takes will at first, and it takes a lot of kind of dedication so that you can force yourself and go through the experience itself. It is painful at the beginning, but it is doable. And then I think in 4 months to maybe 6 months, if the person persists and has they understand within that period of time, that will give the brain enough time to establish better networks and to start. Finally, when these better networks are established, the person chewing gum, the person is not, involved in any of that smoking, and they engage themselves in different kinds of activities, then the other network finds itself not activated for 3 to 4 months, and then that's going to make it less likely. And so as time passes and you use the positive, networks, that other one starts to degrade gradually, and the person then, for that person, smoking becomes history. But it takes that, the first, at the beginning, that is the hardest piece, the first 3 or 4 months. So at the same time, childhood circuits can be altered by passive exposure to unusual environments. So the children don't have to be actively going and engaged and all this. They can be watching or sitting and listening, and usually they don't exert so much effort as we do to learn. But the adult neuroplasticity requires deliberate attention to what is going on. You want to learn something, put effort into it, put motivation into it. So the general principles of connectivity are basically 3. Number 1, that experience or activity stimulates brain connectivity. It stimulates neurons to connect with each other and stimulates different parts of the brain to connect with each other, and to strengthen these connections and to refine them, to make them fine-tuned so that they can do the network can fire and efficiently in a timely manner and robustly. More neurons can fire. So levels and efficiency of, that's the second one. Levels and efficiency of connectivity are proportionately related to the level and extent of the activity. That is extremely, extremely important. Like I go back to the example of the two children, one spending 12 hours learning how to ride the bicycle, one spending 6 hours. So now, which one has greater exposure? Which one is more likely to have a stronger network that will make him or her master the skill more extensively and to show more skill in that area? So the level of efficiency, speed, and accuracy, the level of connectivity, of efficiency of connectivity are proportionately related to the level and to the extent of the activity, how skilled the person is, and the level of exposure that they are getting from that environment in terms of how long they practice, how frequently they practice. So the two of them are parallel to each other, and one, like they are proportionately related. You raise one, you raise the other. And this, I mentioned in a previous recording that the experiments that they did before in the 1990s that resulted in the 13 million word project. And we explained that some children are exposed to a certain number of words and sentences as compared to other children. And then you end up having children by age 3 being exposed to 43 million words, while the other set of children were being exposed to 13 million, which created a 30 million word gap. And that translated into language deficits. It translates into lower IQ, translates into a lot of basically the pre-school skills are not acquired. There is no readiness now in these children. So the more exposed you are to a certain skill, the more activated your circuits become. So activity-dependent control of refinement is a general property that applies to all neural circuits in the brain. So it applies to the vision, to hearing, to basically any system that you can call. So in essence, to summarize, the activity is essential. Activity is essential for shaping the patterns of connectivity in more regions of the central nervous system, and most regions of the central nervous system. If you wonder about these brackets that I have, this means when I quoted this, the A was not capitalized. It was in the middle of a sentence. But now I am making it as the beginning of a sentence, for example. So I modified. So you see these two brackets, it means that I modified this from the original, which was not capitalized. And the opposite is here. That sentence was capitalized, and I put modifications. I put the word dust at the beginning, so I modified the A and made it small so that it will be part of the sentence. So just in case you wonder, some APA. Now, maybe this is a good time. Take a break and then come back in a few minutes so that you can kind of refresh your cognitive reservoir. The critical periods in childhood development or in development of during childhood. This is basically from birth to about 3 or to about 5 for most skills. However, there are other skills that continue to have critical periods in later stages. But still, there's a lot of research that is, that is still needed in these areas. So, a critical period or a sensitive period in development is a time window during which certain kinds of stimulation must occur in order for a certain kind of connection to be made in the brain so that it can give rise to a particular skill to develop or to emerge. Again, a period in time or a window in time during which a specific type of stimulation must be provided in order for a particular skill to emerge. If that window in time closes, then the person is likely to continue throughout life unable to acquire that skill. So it is quite serious, and there are many critical periods out there, and we hope to make people more aware of them, or at least make them aware, because many people might not have that awareness. So, for example, we'll speak about vision and we'll speak about hearing as two kinds of systems. As I continue, I just want to point out this. For example, many studies show, since the emergence of the magic earbuds, the average college student, you walk around, the average college student has a hearing loss of 15 or 20 decibel because of frequently listening like this. And there are, other problems, but at least the hearing is diminished because of constantly bombarding their ears. When they don't even have to do that, they could hear from outside. But, I hope that when I see it, I saw it in the children here. If that is a pattern, it should not be, because it is going to give the baby a hearing loss. As a matter of fact, physicians, for example, using the stethoscope over a period of time, they have a hearing loss related to the stethoscope, like a small one, like a 5 decibel loss, because of using the stethoscope frequently. Now, interestingly, during pregnancy, during the last trimester, we said before that the auditory system, the middle ear and the inner ear are developed almost to adult size. The baby can hear. The ultrasound that is performed in the last trimester is so loud that it can affect the baby's hearing if the procedure is repeated. This is how loud it is. It is equivalent to you standing under a tunnel and the train is passing over your head. Imagine the level of noise with you standing under a tunnel and the train is passing over your head. That is equivalent to the ultrasound, putting it on the stomach, of the mother, to listen to the baby's heart or whatever. And that noise is going to be so loud for the baby. And when the ultrasound is repeated for a certain, repeatedly done, it actually could produce a hearing loss in the baby before the baby is born. So again, these are things we need to make parents aware of, and we don't want a problem to occur even before the baby is born. So now we speak about the critical periods and what would happen if certain skills are not, certain sensory experiences are not provided. What is going to happen? So in some cases, for example, adverse effects of sensory deprivation or adverse effects of atypical experiences, for example, like maybe abuse or stuff like that, that occur early in life cannot easily be reversed by providing the stimulation in later in life after the critical period closes. So we can now understand a baby who's a year old or 2 years old, even 6 months old or younger, that is a critical, really, really remarkable period of time. And the baby is not going to know why. The baby develops this way and becomes a young man and wouldn't know why he or she feels or acts or whatever this way. And if you trace it back, you are going to find causes for it in the very early development. So again, in some cases, the adverse effects of deprivation, such as abuse or neglect, or atypical experience early in life cannot easily be reversed by providing appropriate experience at a later age. It means once the critical period closes, then the brain is, for that skill, is no longer flexible and likely that the person is going to live throughout life like that. However, there's promising research to say that it is possible, maybe it will be possible at some point in the future to reopen these critical periods and to find ways to reteach or to reintroduce the skills and fill these gaps and for example make up for what was lost. But again, I don't know how, because that is a whole new frontier. So now let's see what happens when there's an adverse effect of deprivation. And hearing, we're going to speak about it. We're going to also speak about vision. So the auditory system, in order for you to be able to connect, to make the auditory pathways connect, we'll speak about it more. You have to keep listening to sounds. By age 7 months, as you listen normally to the sounds of your language by hearing by hearing mom and dad and everyone in the environment talking, the baby at 7 months masters the phonetic or the phonemic repertoire of the native language by 7 months. Then there will be a window in time where the baby is still able to distinguish sounds from a different language. For example, like and So you have a Chinese baby, 7 months, the baby can distinguish between and even though, for example, Chinese doesn't have that distinction as a language. But so the baby can distinguish different sounds from different languages, like they're almost like the universal learner in that period in terms of language. And from 7 months to 11, or 7 months to 10 or 11, they still have that flexibility, but once they hit 11 months, then now they have established networks dedicated to the native language, and they're not going to spend effort in any other language. So when they hear another language, it is like noise. Who cares? They ignore it. Unless, of course, you have them intensively exposed and intentionally learning a second language, then it becomes. But they must, in order for someone to learn to learn a second language, they must first acquire a native language of any kind, and during early life. And if they don't, it will make learning a second language very hard, or whatever language that you are gonna trying to teach them. So if, say, someone's coming from Egypt and then that person didn't have the chance in the first year of life to learn Arabic, the Arabic language, because of, whatever was happening. And then that person comes to the United States, he or she will have a tough time acquiring English. And then you wonder at age maybe 7 or 8 years, do they have a language disability, or do they have a what do you call it, a language, or is the native language, say Arabic, interfering with their ability to learn English? In that case, you say, well, the child didn't have a chance to develop any native language in the first place. And if you have them develop any language on earth, that is going to help them learn another language. It will, so because languages have universals. So, now, if there are conductive hearing problems, these are going to cause a lot of abnormalities, many deficits in language and in speech and auditory processing, and you name it. When we say conductive, we mean things that are preventable, like some people have the tendency to accumulate a lot of earwax. We call it cerumen in the ear canals. Sometimes when I go and check, use the otoscope when I do a language eval and check, many of the students, of course, who are referred because of concerns, I frequently find a lot of earwax. Almost sometimes I cannot see the eardrum. And sometimes I can see like this is totally blocked, and this one has like a tiny, like 2/3 are blocked, and one tiny hole where I can peek and visualize the eardrum. So how is the child able to hear anything under these conditions? How will they develop, speech, sound, representations, or language, or concepts, and all of that? It's gonna create a mess. So, in addition, when you have the ear canal plugged with earwax, that will alter the ventilation of the middle ear. And that is going to induce the formation of middle ear fluid infections. And that is going to, of course, in turn, going to lead to language problems and academic problems. And so these conductive hearing problems that result from earwax accumulations and that result from middle ear infections, they are totally preventable. They are totally curable. However, if they stay for a long time and the child keeps having an infection after an infection, basically 4 times a year, that is recurrent middle ear infection. Let's do the simple math. The average individual, healthy human being, would have an infection, and the infection would resolve in 5 to 7 days. So, upper respiratory infection, middle ear infection, 5 to 7 days. And basically that gives the antibodies, that gives the white blood cells the time to go copy, make an image of the pathogen that is coming in, whether bacteria or virus, whatever, make an image of it, go down to the bone marrow and have the bone marrow manufacture weapons, which we call antibodies, that are specified for this particular kind of virus or bacteria. And then process is going to take about 5 to 7 days. It takes actually maybe 3 to 4 by the time all of these antibodies are produced and then they are deployed. It's going to take about 2 days then, or 3, and then by 5 to 7 days, the healthy human being immune system is able to basically fight the the infection. So that is the acute stage of the middle ear infection. However, many kinds of infection are going to resolve, but they leave behind fluid in the middle ear. That fluid could sit for 3 months, 5, 6 months. So it could sit there. And as long as it's sitting there, the child is not hearing well. The child is hearing distorted, muffled sounds, and it's like almost like, so that is going to induce, or it will cause the child to be unable to connect with you as a teacher. And as a result, if I sit with you and I'm not connecting, I have to wonder. I can't just sit there and just, for a long time without, if I'm not engaged in what you say and I have my brain make meaning of what you are saying, I'm immediately going to start to daydream, to wander. And the longer the problem is here, the longer my nervous system will be used now. So that in response, as soon as I come to the class, 5 to 10 seconds, and then I am not connecting, I start to daydream, my nervous system will learn not to pay attention. It is like you sitting down and you hear the dishwasher going. The first maybe 15 seconds or so, you make the noise is disturbing you, and then immediately you're going to habituate, and the sound is just not processed. You do not even hear it at all. And the person is like that. When they can't connect with you, your voice becomes simple noise. They do not basically even hear it. And that is, they start to daydream. And again, when the nervous system gets used to that, it is going to rewire itself so that it learns not to pay attention. And in some cases now, you have to, you go and you have concerns about attention. And people might not be aware of the hearing cause. And sometimes the infections might have resolved at that time, but the effect of them lasts for months and probably, more years. So, that could mimic the symptoms of ADHD, and many cases that are caused by middle ear infections basically look like ADD, and in some cases ADHD, and the person really doesn't have ADHD, but they have hearing. Some kind of inattention that's induced by the hearing, the conductive hearing loss, or the middle ear infections. And the evidence is, when we say someone has ADHD, and we say ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, that means that the person is going to live with it throughout their lives. Like autism, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. But when you look at the statistics, you are going to find that 30% to 80% of people who have ADHD, they grow out of it, they go into remission as they transition into adulthood. Now, that means that there's a lot that is misdiagnosed, because if someone has it, they should have it, throughout life. But the fact is, people who are sleep deprived, many of them are diagnosed with ADHD. People who have a history of middle ear infections, many of them are diagnosed with ADHD. So these are the people who, later, when these issues resolve, the problem with hearing and so on, then the nervous system gets to, of course, again, with proper intervention, the nervous system then gets to rewire itself again in a positive way, hopefully with positive sensory stimulation, and that is going to be a person who is going to grow or go into remission without symptoms of ADD or ADHD as they enter adulthood. So you can see the connections now and how this connects to different, on multiple levels, even not just with childhood experiences, but experiences that last through adulthood. So there are experiences. I mean, we understand, of course, there are kids who are born with no ability to hear. The cochleae are not functioning, and they have cochlear implants. But there are people who choose not to fit their kids with cochlear implants. In that case, do you think the child is going to learn how to talk? They're not going to talk. They can make noises and the child is going to babble and all, but that child is not going to talk at all, is not going to produce human speech. So that is total, which is complete deafness. That is total auditory deprivation, and that's going to make the brain develop in a totally different way, but in terms of language and in terms of how it is processed. So, again, if there's someone who has a sensory neural hearing loss, like hearing loss that is not reversible, that is caused by either the damage in the cochlea or some kind of problem in the auditory pathways or the auditory nerve, that means the severity of the problem is going to be determined by, the severity of the deficit will be determined by the severity of the problem. Another examples of the role of the critical periods or sensitive periods and how sensory stimulation is important is autism. There's a whole line of research that shows that autism may be related to impaired reorganization of neural circuits during the critical periods. So again, there's there are many things that are not understood yet about autism, but there are also a lot of things that are understood. So why is it important to learn about the critical periods? Obviously, I hope you have figured it out by now. Number one, it will help us provide stimulation at the right time. Imagine if you take the information that you learn this week and share it with parents with mothers who will be pregnant at in the near future or who are pregnant now. Imagine what a difference that is gonna mean to them. So it will help us actually prevent many disabilities from developing in the first place. It will enable us to provide medical treatments before the window of time closes. It also, so for example, congenital cataracts. Congenital cataracts, if a baby is born with cataracts and say the cataracts are removed at age 2 years, then the baby is still able to regain visual acuity. But if you wait for a particular window of time, then the child is not going to be able to regain visual acuity at all. There's also strabismus that is kind of enables us to, it affects the ability that's called stereopsis, which is depth of vision. So if a child, a baby has strabismus and the surgery is performed, like say at age 10 years or after, then there's no difference. The problem is not corrected. But if you perform it before, in the earlier years of childhood, then the baby has a higher likelihood of regaining normal vision. So we will be able to look, treat conditions like this within the critical period and before it closes. And that also will help us, to avoid long-term deficits that can result from these abnormalities. So a lot of prevention, a lot of intervention as well. Okay. So what makes the critical periods so critical? The reason, or what makes them occur, is that during these windows of time, post-synaptic structures are reorganized during these periods of time. So, for example, we have a neuron, This is a part of a dendrite that is going to receive signals. This is a synaptic terminal from another neuron. So they make a synapse. This is synapse. When you look at it, it's in the middle. And the neuron that is sending a signal is called the presynaptic neuron. The neuron that is receiving is called the postsynaptic neuron. So the postsynaptic neuron structure here is going to be modified, is going to be rearranged and reorganized during the critical periods. So that is going to be providing flexibility. And at some point it will be malleable and so on. But once that closes, then that flexibility will not be there in that particular kind of structure. So the synapses during the critical periods undergo significant changes and modifications, and the dendritic spines undergo also changes. So here are the dendritic spines. If you take a neuron and you see these little dendrites, take one dendrite and you see all these little budding, areas here, these are synaptic spines. And they account for a huge part of the development of the brain in volume, because there are billions and billions of them. Their presence, when they show up like this, that means that there will be synaptic connections, because they are the sites where neurons connect with other neurons. And when they start to be missing or to be absent, then it means that synapses are being dismantled and removed. So you could see here, this is part of the postsynaptic membrane neuron, and all these structures here, the protein channels will be rearranged, will be decreased or increased, or based on whatever change is going to occur. And there are other proteins and a whole set of molecules and ions and all of this will be modified in a different way based on the nature of the critical period we are speaking about. So what happens to dendritic spines? These, again, they are small protrusions from the dendrites of many cortical neurons on which excitatory synapses are formed, so that the neurons connect and just fire and then send the signal to activate the other neuron. They are dynamic structures. It means that they do not stay fixed all the time. They just emerge, and based on the stimulation, there might be more of them, or the ones that are there more, and they become bigger and more sophisticated. But because they are dynamic, they could also shrink and be dismantled and disappear from one side, and then the material is used to build other ones on the other side. So this is why they are always constantly changing. And their appearance and their loss are thought to reflect the formation and the elimination of synapses. So if you see more of them emerging, that's a sign that there are synapses forming. If you see less, that means that synapses are being severed at that part. So spine motility, the appearance and reappearance, and disappearance is especially marked during early postnatal development. So these synaptic, spines, dendritic spines are constantly emerging in certain areas and constantly disappearing from certain areas. Because remember, there's a lot of pruning and a lot of cell death, apoptosis. So I think an increase in spine dynamics and the number have been associated with changes in behavior. So now these are physical structural changes in the brain that result from stimulation. And then once they are there, they are going to establish patterns of connectivity that will result in specific behaviors that you and I are going to see in the child or the adult. So here again, these are synaptic dendritic spines. And these are the dendrites, just like the branches of a tree. And if you take one of them, these are the spines on the sides. And there are several types of them, and each one is associated with particular neurons and stuff. So, social development. Now we're going to look at the effect of early life experiences on the development of human mental functions. Social development, in order for someone to develop normal social skills, that person has to have early interactions early in their lives with other human beings, at least 2 adults whom the baby can trust and feel safe with. That is one requirement. And also, the baby has to observe other children interacting and communicating and playing, and to have opportunities to interact and to communicate and to play with other children. So at least 2 adults, and then opportunities to interact with other children like him or her. In the 1940s, there was a set of experiments conducted by Spiss. They're called the Spiss experiments. And they wanted to see the effect of the environment, of course, on social development. So they had a group of babies raised up in a foundling home. Foundling comes from the word found. A foundling is a little baby who was found somewhere, basically abandoned by, the parents, and then they were taken, whether by a church or by, whatever organization where they found the baby, and they would put them in a house, in a place to take care of them, for orphans and for abandoned babies. And they had the other cohort of babies basically in a prison attached to, in a nursing home attached to a prison. So you had in the nursing home, you had, staff, but you had the mothers who were in jail come in and would spend time with their babies a certain number of hours a day, and they would interact with the babies, actually a few hours a day. But they would kind of hold the babies and shower them with praise and love and affection and interaction, and the babies would have a chance to interact with the guards, with the fellow prisoners, with, staff and, different people around. And the cribs were open. And then on the other side, on the foundling home, the cribs were covered by a sheet that is dim, and the baby couldn't see behind, what's outside, what's going on outside of the crib. And they had one nurse responsible for a number of babies, and there weren't as many people around for the baby to interact with. Basically just one nurse. And when she goes, another nurse who takes over the shift, would come in. And I really, frankly, as I was reading this, I was appalled. I said, how could they allow something like this? So basic. Anyone could understand that wasn't normal. How could they allow something like this to happen? So babies in the foundling home, they did better, when they were 4 months old. They did some testing, developmental testing, and they did relatively better compared to the other babies. But at age 12 months, there was a significant motor and intellectual delay, in these babies generally, compared to the other babies in the prison nursing home. They were significantly better in performance at age 12 months. At the same time, to 24 months of age, there was, on the foundling home babies, there were further delays. Many were unable to walk. Many were unable to say more than a few words. So significant disabilities. And then the children in the prison nursing home, they were, agile, curious, had a large vocabulary. They were speaking in sentences at 24 months. And that is the average. When babies between 18 months and 24 months, they start combining words into sentences. So they developed a natural development because they had the chance to interact with different people, and basically that is one of the biggest things that are needed. So you could see now the effect of this. And moreover, the kids in the foundling home were followed later by several long-term studies, longitudinal studies, and these studies showed that these kids basically had hospitalism syndrome, and which means they had cognitive, social, and emotional deficits, including withdrawal and decreased curiosity. They just didn't care much about anything, less happy, and they were prone to infections because the immune system was suppressed because of there's no social life basically that they had, and they were probably facing lots of stress, and that would make them prone to infections. So that is when they discovered, they called that syndrome hospitalism, and institutionalization produces the same symptoms. But basically that is the result of sensory deprivation. And these consequences of sensory deprivation that are experienced in early childhood can be long life, can last throughout life. So kids that grew up in institutions, they were never able to develop normal social relationships with their peers or even with their family members. And neural imaging shows that their brains were significantly altered enough for that alteration and structures to show up on neuro images. Imagine. So sensory deprivation results in physical structural alterations in the brain. Deprivation was found to increase movement and turnover of dendritic spines. Basically, they get rearranged and then they just are disassembled and they disappear. These changes, again, disappear after prolonged deprivation. That if the child continues to experience this, then the dendritic spines are going to basically disappear, and the synaptic connections with them will disappear, and that's gonna continuous, will exist, basically can last throughout their lives. I worked with 3 children. Not all of them, but I worked with 2 in speech therapy. And that 3 children had traumatic experiences. Basically, the mother and her boyfriend would lock them up, the 3 of them, in a closet and could leave them for a half a day at a time. And the oldest one got the brunt of it. He saw that many, like more than the others. And he was diagnosed with autism, basically. He got the brunt of it. And he could not, he was put in a substantially separate classroom throughout most of his schooling. And he's an adult now and has a job, but in assisted living, and he needs a lot of help because of that unfortunate experience that he was subjected, all that abuse. Finally the grandparents took them, took custody of them. But the second one, who was younger, had less time under these conditions, and he exhibits less of, it is slightly less. The youngest one, who was several years younger, he was the one who is basically he didn't experience this as much, and he is just about typical development. So you could see the more that negative experience lasts, the longer the impact and the more likely that it will last throughout life. So prolonged deprivation causes loss of dendritic spines. Physical structures just disappear. And also synapses all, get disassembled. So the effect is devastating on brain architecture. So the timing of the critical periods, different skills are matched with different milestones are matched with different critical periods. And at the same time, because the brain doesn't grow in a systematic way, like so from front to back or from top to down, it doesn't. We said it is based on the function. What does the baby need to survive in a particular period of time? Then develop these skills for the baby at that time. So also, different parts of the brain, different locations develop faster than others. So there's that critical period for different senses, critical periods for different regions, for example. So that there's a lot of diversity in terms of development in the brain. So the critical period they occur at different times in different brain regions, and the adverse consequences of sensory deprivation for the primary sensory regions of the brain are generally fully realized early in postnatal development. What does that mean? Primary sensory regions. The brain has primary areas that are responsible for particular skills. Like there's an area called the primary auditory cortex that is responsible for translating the signals you hear into meaning and telling you what that means. And there is a primary somatosensory cortex, for example, that enables you to have sensation, to feel touch, and to feel different, textures and things, pain, whatever it is. So, and the primary motor cortex. So these primary areas serve as the main engines of particular skills that they are specialized in. And they work with other areas to make that possible. So these areas, the primary sensory regions of the brain, they are fully realized early in postnatal development. That means that the critical periods regarding these skills occurs in the first 3 to 5 years of life. And that basically, if the skills are not provided then, you're going to have deficits in all of these areas, or depending on what kind of stimulation is missing. However, and just to say one more thing, say, for example, hearing is going to, when the individual, or the ability to master, the sounds of a language, we said 7 months. 7 to 10 months, and then the window is shut, and that's it. So in terms of social experiences, these are more complex, and they continue over a long span in the lifetime. So they affect intracortical, multiple cortical areas of the brain are engaged in social abilities. For example, some areas might be evaluating certain things. Other areas might be storing experiences about this and that. Other areas might be looking at threats and evaluating, values and all of this about the person. So anyways, these social experiences can affect the intracortical connections over a much longer period of time. So that makes them more complicated. And those differences explain again why certain types of learning are optimal at particular stages in development. So certain social skills must be acquired early in life, and then other skills continue to develop. Basically, social skills can continue throughout life, depending on how, communities that you learn, that you get to see that you have never seen. Like if you travel to China, you're going to learn more social skills. You travel to Germany, you're going to still learn new social skills and so on. So that's a skill basically that develops, and you can add to it and stimulate the development of it through experience. The critical periods close. Why do they just open for a window, a limited window of time, and then they close? And the reason is that synaptic stabilization is, it occurs when the synapses form, and they get kind of connected, and they want to stay, become stable. But this is when they close. But because these synaptic and synapses and circuits are labile, they change frequently during the critical periods. When the stabilization occurs, they become less likely to be modified. They resist modification. And at the same time, the axons become mature, and that maturation process will induce stability and will reduce flexibility. And also you have perineural nets. These are areas that are rich in synaptic density, but they're focused in particular areas. When they form, that they release particular molecules to induce lack of stability, lack of flexibility. So myelin itself, as it continues and it reaches a certain level, it produces chemicals to kind of say, well, stop growing. I'm going to make this axon stop growing. It's not supposed to be longer, for example, or thicker. Just make it inhibit growing, like you as an adult, for example. So it also has agents that are going to inhibit formation of other connections. The critical periods close again, as I mentioned, axonal maturation. The axon itself matures, and myelin then isolates the sprouting axons and inhibits their further growth. So that has signals to say, you have reached your maximum limit, you need to stop growing. And the perineural nets, these form around specific classes of inhibitory neurons around the critical periods, but they start to be stabilized. And once they are stable now, they also make it less likely, make flexibility a little bit less likely to occur. So the molecular barriers that, that prevent synaptic growth, new synapses from forming, relatively, they continue, but relatively, and rearrangement of the synapses, that basically these molecular barriers kind of block the formation of new synapses in certain areas during the critical periods. And once they close, then the situation becomes stable, and the skill could continue, toward life, throughout life. So stabilization of brain circuits and various brain areas occurs at different times, as I mentioned. And even different layers of the cortex have their own, their own periods of time when they need a particular level of stimulation in response to experience. And then once they reach a certain point in time, they are stable and they stop. They start to close. So here are the synapses and how they form. For example, there are sets of molecules called adhesion molecules. What holds the two sides of the synapse together. For example, you can see here. And every time you experience exposure or repeat or see the information again or see a person over and over, the synapses have more of these adhesion molecules, and that will hold more and more the two sides of the synapse together, so that the information will be memorable and the synapse will be more stable, so the information doesn't go away. So, what are the advantages of closing the critical periods? Why? So, number one, the energy redistribution that the brain uses is based on the fact that, say, if you are not using a particular, or you are not stimulating a particular pathway or a particular connection, then it would make sense to just take the resources you dedicated to that area and just reroute them and send them to an area that is firing and active. It doesn't make sense to just keep resources there and you only have a limited space in your skull. So if a specific sense is not given the opportunity to function, the nervous system will reallocate its resources to those that are functioning. That's efficient. That is perfect. And then large-scale rearrangement of brain structures would lead to loss of memory and loss of skills. Like if you were to come as an adult and say, okay, I'm going to have the same flexibility as a baby, that means anything can change these circuits and alter them, and basically you will not be able to hold on to memory or to any kind of learning. And at the same time, things are going to be just arranging and rearranging in a way that it cannot support our survival. We look at the visual system and how that system basically works in terms of within the context of visual experience. So the visual pathways and the visual perception require visual stimulation like light, exposure, colors, movement, and so on. And the critical periods determine the nature of connectivity and the function of the visual system, like hearing. So here, is your lens, light comes in, refracts, and then you see these nicely, beautifully organized cells. Now you have bipolar cells, but these rods, cones, rods, they they fully develop by the 4th month of life, and that enables the baby to see in color, but see just the patterning and the arrangement. And so again, you have to have stimulation. And we spoke about the condition of cataracts and the critical periods. If cataracts are like surgically removed in a certain period, early childhood, then the problem can be reversed. The baby or the child is going to regain visual acuity. However, if the cataracts occur in an adult and even last for like a decade or even 2 decades, once you do the surgery, the person will immediately regain their sight. Why? Because the system is stable and it has already been established, and it is not ready to dismantle itself because of the cataract that lasts for 10 or 20 or 30 years. So you could understand the system has been formed and established, but for the child, that system, didn't go through the critical periods. And now, if it passes beyond the critical period, it will never function again. They did total visual deprivation experiments in animals. And for example, get a barn owl and they tape one eye and make the other one just, see. And in very shortly, very quickly, the nervous system starts to kind of, not rely on this eye much, and will take resources and stuff and put it on the other eye to make the other eye stronger, to make it compensate for the input that is lost from the other eye. So, also, they found that the problem of that total deprivation, if they removed the patch from the eye of the animal within 2 months, then, when the baby is 2 months old, then vision is regained. But after 4 months, then that animal doesn't regain sight at all. And we mentioned about strabismus. Again, if the surgery is conducted earlier in life, the problem is the effect is reversed. If it passes, like, say, a certain period, like 10 years or so, then you can do the surgery, but the problem will not be corrected. So again, that's a big system that shows the presence of critical periods in many parts of it. So the results of the studies on visual perception, they have demonstrated that cortical connections, the cortex, that control visual perception are established within a critical period of early development. And if that window closes, that, animal or child is going to be blind for life. So sensory deprivation early in life alters the structure of the cerebral cortex. What else do we have that is greater testimony to the value of experience and the value of what you do in the classroom, giving that sensory experience and sensory stimulation, visual, auditory, and all that you do? You are basically shaping the brain of generations. So here's the magic, cerebral cortex. It has 6 layers. That's actual tissue. Of course, it's magnified like millions of times because the thickness of it is 4 millimeters. The thickness of it. So, the auditory system, please watch this video. I just feel that the video has become long, and but you can pause it and listen to it. The auditory system is one of the most plastic systems, and it remains like this throughout adulthood. And it is malleable. It is, with stimulation or lack of stimulation, it's going to wire and rewire itself. So it is activity dependent and experience dependent, and the activity enables the formation of patterns of connectivity of this auditory system. The auditory system has two parts, basically the peripheral, which means the outer ear, and the cochlea, the outer ear, middle ear, and the cochlea, inner ear. All of these are part of the peripheral system, and then everything neural is part of the central nervous system. So this part, the blue segment here, this is the part of the cortex that enables us to interpret signals and connect sounds together to make syllables and words. It's called the primary auditory cortex. And you can see it's arranged in a certain way. And with stimulation, see, you have all these frequency patterns that go from the lowest to the highest, like say 25, 30, and so on. You go 500, and then all of these are organized in columns and connected in a very, very precise way, so that every segment is going to code for a particular pitch. But lack of sensory experience or exposure, for example, to negative experiences like having the baby exposed to lots of noises and meaningless sounds, that is going to alter the composition or the organization of the tonotopic specialization of the auditory cortex. That is serious, like exposure to noise or lack of exposure to adequate sounds or speech sounds, and lack of sensory experiences is going to alter the organization of this whole thing, and the person will have difficulties with auditory processing. We call it central auditory processing problems. But I can tell you these are very hard to diagnose, and there's a lot of knowledge there. But unfortunately, I haven't met many audiologists or many speech language pathologists who are actually able to look deeper into this and can help kind of people based on what they see now, like say the effect of noise and the effect of sensory deprivation. So when someone hears a signal, over and over, that signal stimulates the formation of the map itself. It makes it connect in rows and columns of neurons that are specialized in particular pitches of sound. And it makes all this grid, all this map connect efficiently, so the person can process and make sense very quickly, make sense of what they hear. So the areas that are affected include the cochlear nucleus, inferior colliculus, primary auditory cortex. You don't have to worry about this, but all of these are in these areas here, where the signals become processed before they go into that structure, the primary auditory cortex. These are the auditory pathways going up, and this is where the middle ear and inner ear and all this, and this is the auditory nerve. So exposure to noise again impairs refinement of the tuning curves of the neurons in the inferior colliculus. It means these neurons build tuning curves. In other words, they specialize in particular pitches by hearing these pitches over and over, and they keep firing. They say, now we became specialists. Whenever you play this tone, we are going to respond. But, with noise and stuff, that is going to make them unable to do their work or to specialize. Exposure to specific frequencies enhances sound representation of these frequencies in the auditory maps, like hearing the sounds, hearing rhymes, hearing vocabulary, hearing meaningful words and all of this, or music and so on. That is going to stimulate the formation and the patterning of the map. So, whoops. Let's see. So auditory maps are also coordinated and integrated during the critical period. So that system has many critical periods, and early in life, the formation of these maps as they specialize in different tones, that is in early childhood. So neural circuitry organization not only optimizes processing of information in the sensory modality, but also brings information from multiple sensory modalities into register. It means that when reorganization occurs in response to auditory stimulation, that optimizes the processing of information, number one. Number two, it induces multi-sensory integration. When you get visual inputs integrated with auditory inputs, integrated with motor inputs, for example, and that imagine the person may be dancing, you have to watch the group so you can perform like them. You have to listen to the rhythm so you can follow and activate your motor movements in response to that music, and then so you coordinate multiple sensory modalities together to perform a certain function. So sensory integration, this is what it is about. So again, sensory stimulation induces or maximizes the processing of information in the auditory system and allows auditory information to be integrated with other sensory modalities, including vision, including for example, motor skills, and so on. So, and the level of integration becomes more precise during adolescence, because in adolescence, this is the last major reconstruction stage where you get a lot of construction going, and then you go, okay, now we are stable, and let's just keep going at a lower pace. So, in summary, and again, I apologize for this being so long, but just pause it every half an hour maybe. So the brain development is the outcome of sensory stimulation. That is, again, over and over, this is how learning is established. This is how we can do any kind of skill by sensory stimulation. And every sense that we have requires the particular stimulation that matches it. You have the auditory system. That auditory system will not develop normally if it is not exposed to sounds over and over and over, different kinds of sounds and so on. The visual system is not going to develop or be functional, unless you have visual stimulation. So, and so on. So it's like these sensory mechanisms have to be fed. They have to run to be activated so that they can connect. The brain comes to life with tentative networks that are malleable, that are modifiable, that are not hardwired, and then the environment is going to sculpt them and gradually make them more stable and would make them less resistant. More resistant to change by adolescence, and then throughout life they start to be stable, and you can modify depending on your level of learning, your level of cognitive flexibility, how much motivation you have in order to seek developing and expanding your skills, and there's no limit throughout life, basically. So all learning is experience dependent. You do it, you see it, and so on, and then it becomes part of your knowledge. Sensory deprivation during childhood years will cause levels of neurocognitive, neurodevelopmental, neuroemotional impairments that are correlated with, number one, with the age during which the deprivation occurs, with how long, like the severity, like the example of the 3 brothers I mentioned, and the duration, how long the person experienced, and how severe the problem was. So understanding brain connectivity and the critical periods will enable us basically to provide effective interventions and to also provide prevention. So I hope that you find this to be, to be a unit that gives you the ability to derive a lot of strategies and a lot of, advice, pieces of advice, recommendations that you can share with parents, with educators, with even lawmakers. And there are many, many ways you can use this information and, to spread it around because of how important it is. So thank you, and I look forward to reading your discussions. Thank you.